So I titled the set state may be good enough. The idea is like, you don't need Redux all the time. And people who jump into a React project are typically, they're likely to want to start with Redux too. It's kind of it's the hotness right now. And I feel like there's so many tutorials out there right now on how to use Redux. I want to give a talk that was a little different, maybe when to use Redux or why you should be using Redux. So a little about me. I am Jordan Hammond. I'm a software developer for a company called Smashing Boxes. It is in Durham, North Carolina in the United States. And we do just general custom software solutions. I'm not really sure what our slogan is, but I deal with the software side of things. And before I got into software development, I studied history in college, and I was in the US Navy briefly before I went into a coding boot camp. And that's how I got here today. My stack is Ruby on Rails, Node, Express, and React with Redux. Those are the three main stacks I use throughout my professional development. And so far, I would say React and Redux has been the most prevalent for me. So that's why I feel comfortable at least giving a talk on Redux. And one more thing, I just realized, there's just so much to talk about with Redux. Again, I wanted to focus it just on when and why. So let's get to the most important part, why this talk. Phew. Oh, I was hoping you guys would laugh. Oh. So the guy who came up with this, Dan Abramoff, he said local state is fine. He's the guy who came up with Redux, and he's a co-author of Redux. And he thinks that Redux can sometimes be a little, I don't know, people can just be driven to it simply because it's what's going on with React right now. He said local state is fine. So why this talk again? Redux is complicated. React Redux is complicated. These are packages that we use in just our simple boilerplate at the very minimum level. We use these 5 extra packages within React Redux, and within Redux the package. We're using these 5 methods right off the bat. So there's domain knowledge that you need to know right off the bat. You don't have to necessarily use what I'm using on my, and I say we, Smashing Boxes, my company. You don't necessarily need to use the same packages we're using, but at the very least, at our base level, these are already things that we have to know about immediately. And so right off the bat, again, there's domain knowledge that's necessary. And this is kind of like when you think about when you think about Redux and state, you're talking about what's the short-term versus long-term decision here. And this is, I said features as in the y-axis. That's probably not accurate. You can have an app with a lot of features that still doesn't need Redux. But that's the only thing I could think of to really demonstrate size. Either way, there's a point where Redux, if you had installed it from the beginning, you're probably going to save time on your features from then on out. Local state is fine. I'm using setState in this example, but eventually there's going to come a point where you probably would have been better off had you used Redux. And it's never that Redux is bad for a just base app. It just could be overkill. Whenever you're using Redux, you have to do a lot of setup. There's a lot of boilerplate with it, and I'll talk about all that later. But it's not like it's bad. It's just you may spend a huge amount of time and have no features to show for it from the beginning. Let's see. It's highly opinionated. There's the philosophy behind Redux, which is your state should be represented by a JavaScript object. All changes must be passed as JavaScript objects, and those changes must be passed via pure functions. So Redux is a small library, and learning the API isn't the problem. It's the paradigm shift. The tiny amount of building blocks and self-imposed limitations from using pure functions and immutable data, which I'll get to later, it can constrain you and it can limit you, and that can maybe be a paradigm shift that makes you uncomfortable, or you don't like that constraint. So it's not that Redux, it can be complicated just because it's an extra API, but it's not necessarily more complicated than other APIs or other technologies. It's, again, the biggest drawback is how highly opinionated it is. So Oops, where's that slide at? I think I moved a slide around. Oh well. So the next one is, I just want to say, what is state management? That's kind of like a buzzword that I've said to some of you as I've talked about this talk I'm going to give. And so just before I go any further, I want to say what I mean by state management, or what I think state management means. I just think it means storage and how you handle storage. And that's like, maybe you need to talk about how you're storing a user that you want to be signed in, a project that is featured, that has an active state. Just there's so many things you might want to store. And I'm using store with quotations because Redux is not storage, but it does make your storage kind of clean and can make it clearer too. So what we'll cover, I want to explain state management through a React app without state, a React app with local state, a React app with local state and API requests, and I'm going to use my portfolio, which has an API for it, to make those requests. And then I'm going to move it all over to Redux so we can see how it compares and maybe if that's good or bad. And then I'll give some examples and a conclusion. There it is. That was the slide I was looking for. Let's see. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get into the code here. So I don't know everybody's level, and especially for the camera, there may be people who haven't really used React. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction of what's going on with React so that I can explain why using local state may be good. So just to start out, I have these four front ends here, which are going to be on GitHub at the end of this talk, and so you all can look at it later if you want. The first one is just this one without state, and I have a Webpack configuration. I'm using Yarn. None of that matters. That's just the basic setup for it. What matters is what's going on in my source file. So in index.jsx, all you need to know right now is that I have a component called app, and I'm passing in a property called name that's with Dojo Bali. If you haven't used Redux, react.dom.render is just there to pass this component, to the actual page, which is what you're seeing here. So in the component, we have app, and we are now passing greeting and name taker within our app component. So greeting here, it's another function, and it's passing in HTML elements. Name taker is a little different. You can see that it is a class that is taking the properties of component, and component here is coming from React. So not to talk too much about what's going on in name taker, what you should know, all that's really important right now for this example is what do you need React for this? Why can't you just put the HTML elements in here? There's so many reasons why you may not need React, but I'll quickly show you what happens if you get rid of React for a second. You're going to have, let's see, is this the right one I'm on? Make sure. I may not be on the right one. That's it. And refresh. Yeah, okay, so I just need it to be refreshed. So it says React is not defined, and that's because when I do this, when I pass in these, that's all React is. You need React so you can do things like passing components within components. And so within this example, that's all that React is needed for. But let's go and take it a step further. We need to, let's say we want to take this, and I don't know why it's not refreshing. Just give me 1 second. For some reason, it's not listening to my changes, which is good, which is lovely. So I'm going to probably have to make all the changes at once, and then we'll have to do a refresh in the end, which isn't a big deal. So the big thing we want to do, though, is see that whatever I type in here displays here, which it didn't just now, because the code isn't ready for that. That'd be awesome if we could just submit Jordan, and we could see Jordan here instead of Dojo Bali. So let's try something to make that work. Within name taker, I can take on a function called onSubmit, and that onSubmit function is going to be called here. Now that's going to be called here. So if I want this input, whenever I hit on submit to submit a function, I can I can make that function appear up here. So I'm going to call it function on submit. I'm going to take a name, and let's go ahead and set a variable up here called we'll call it a component name, and we're going to set component name to name. And then in greeting, I want to show component name if it exists. If not, then just show the original name. And sorry, one more thing. Got to pass on submit as a property to the name taker component. There we go. So theoretically, I should be getting this on submit function here all the way into this component. And theoretically, it should display the component name here. So just to see what happens, like see if it's even getting called, which we should know. Called. I'm going to just log it. And this may not even, oh cool, it's reading it again. So let's try it. Jordan. Okay, we see now what happened. It got called, and this is very tiny. I apologize. We see that the function got called, but we don't see this changing right here. It should have been Jordan. So we could probably come up with some fancy solution, something really cool to make this work, but that fancy solution is React. So let's go ahead and use React for what it's good for, or one of the things it's good for, which is using its local state. So I'm gonna get rid of all this. We don't need it anymore. I'm gonna change this to name, or back to name. And let's use this stuff that's going on, over here. I'm gonna call this, I'm gonna use a constructor, which is standard for React. I'm gonna pass in the props. There we go. Oops. There we go. Super props. And super props are just something that you do in these situations. And I'm going to set the name equal to props.name. And then when we get here, I can call this.state.name and this.state.name. And before we go any further, let's just make sure that is working. Nope. I have a syntax error somewhere. Let's see. What line did it say it's on? Got it on. Oh gosh, of course. Got to change this to got to make it derived from the class. Or sorry, from component. So we got to change it. So what was going on beforehand? This over here, this function, that's a stateless function. And that's not good for what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to turn it into a stateful function, which is what's going on with this component. And we have to bring in component from React. There we go. And let's see if that works. Nope. So got a syntax error. We're returning. Oh, got to call the render method. There we go. And let's see what happens. Excellent. So we can see that this.state.name is working, which is local state in practice. But what we actually want to do, like I said, is make sure that when I hit Jordan, it changes to Jordan, which is not yet. So let's make a function called onSubmit. Takes a name, and it changes the state. There we go. And let's take this onSubmit function and send it to nametaker. Oops, this.onSubmit. There we go. So let's see what happens if I change it to Jordan. Boom, it changes. Yay. That is local state in a nutshell. That's what we want. That's what we can use React for, to make sure these changes come through. So we don't have to we don't have to refactor our own solution, come up with something that's even fancier. So now that we've seen that in action, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the next one. Or sorry, I'm going to skip. So I just did one with state. I'm going to jump into the one with API request. And that's happening here. So this is my portfolio. I promise this wasn't a talk just to show my portfolio, but I have an API for it, and it has projects with a name, a description, a bunch of things. And so I'm going to use my local server to pull an API request. I have some mock data on there, and what I want to do is see the projects like this, and I want to see a featured project. I want to see if you click something, I want to see the featured project change. So let's talk about what that looks like on a bigger level, because what we showed here, is cool, but it's at a small level. And to give you a quick understanding of what's going on, this is just simply what you can look at on the project within my portfolio. That's all it brings in, just a bunch of properties. So the actual, skipped ahead again. Our component, the app component, just got huge. It's now, this is again, just using local state. I haven't brought in Redux or anything yet. Still using local state. It just got pretty big. Let's start at the very top. We have project service. That is a service I wrote. Doesn't do anything special. All it does, this is the function I wrote so we can actually make a get all request for all my projects. Just know that it's a service and I'm only using it to make an API request from the front end. Within the local state, the initial state, I'm now setting a feature project. I'm still setting name because we have that input, and I'm setting projects. And as soon as the component mounts, I'm actually going to go ahead and make a request for even more, for the actual projects. So as soon as I get them all, I can pass them in, and we can see the projects here. The actual work behind this isn't too intense. It's still a small app, nothing too fancy, but you can see that I've brought in 2 more components: feature project, which is another stateless function; projects, another stateless function that takes on a specific class if it's featured and displays the title. So it's nothing too fancy there, but this file now has to do 3 things. Whereas as soon as the component mounts, we have to set the state to the new projects. We have to keep our onSubmit function that we had, and we have to add another one called update feature project that is being passed to the project's component that's eventually going to be able to set the new feature project. So that's somewhat like, this is a small app, but that was a little tough to convey just how much is going on in this file, what's happening with just local state. And that, one second, that is, yeah. And that's kind of almost the problem. Now, I'm not saying Redux is needed for this right now. The app is still small, but what happens when something like this becomes this? That may be a time when you would need Redux, but at least right now, it's probably not needed. However, it's going to get messy. If we start taking this, go away. Oh well. If we start taking this to make it this whole file is gonna get messy. It's gonna become a 200-line file. There's just so much going on in this file that it could become it could almost become a nightmare. So we would probably need to refactor this in some way, somehow get all these functions into their own, file, maybe separate things elsewhere, it doesn't matter. But that refactor is Redux. So let's bring in Redux and see if it makes our lives easier, harder, makes it more confusing, less confusing. Let's see how that looks. So architecturally, Redux is just 3 things: reducers, actions, and a dispatcher. The dispatcher is the store, which I'm not going to bring in right yet, but the dispatcher is the dispatch method is going to come from the store. So let's go ahead and get started with this. Let's start with the reducer itself. We're not going to use any packages. We're just going to do it all right in this file here. So function reducer. And the reducer takes on an initial state. And we'll just do an empty object for now. And it takes an action. And every reducer uses switch statements. So we're going to use that as well. And I never quite get the syntax right, but we'll see how this goes. I think it's just like this. And we'll have a default, and we'll have it return state. I think that's formatted correctly. We'll see. It'll yell at me if it's not. So we have this reducer, and what we're trying to do is take all these instances of setState and change them over to some better way of handling all this. So this reducer we have here, we're just going to have it return state. We're going to talk about more why in 1 second, we're just going to talk about why it's good and why a reducer is useful in this situation. But the reducer has to be used in the initial, or sorry, we're going to use the reducer to set the initial state. So we're going to first make this change here. This dot state. Oops. This dot set state. Is that right? Let's see. There we go. We need a, I think this is right. Is that set state? Nope. There we go. This dot set state. We're going to set it to whatever the reducer returns. So we're going to change this to just an initial state. There we go. And we're not going to pass it an action type because we don't need to yet. And so what we're going to do is change this initial state to whatever the reducer is returning, which in the moment is just state. So let's see if this works. Okay, cool. Nothing's broken. Everything's working. That's good to see. And make sure. Nope. So this here, this initial state has gotten made because, or sorry, the initial state has been made from the reducer. But let's take it a step further and let's use the reducer to change the name. So I'm gonna change this to change name because on submit isn't quite what we want. It doesn't convey necessarily what I'm doing. So all I'm gonna do with this is I want it to change the name. And the actual, we're gonna use the reducer in this case. Let's see. I'm gonna just do a quick peek at the head just so I can make sure I'm doing this right. There we go. Yeah, so I need to actually, sorry, I was jumping ahead. We need to first set a dispatch function. That's what I was forgetting. There we go. So the dispatch function is, this is what we're gonna use to actually call the reducer, or to use the reducer to set the state. So we're gonna do it here, return this dot set state. And set state takes an argument, or sorry, take a callback, and so we're gonna use it in this, for this example. And previous state and action. So now we have a dispatcher, we have a reducer, and now all we need is the action to really meet architecturally what Redux is. So I'm going to go down here, return this dot dispatch, an action. Let's see, we're gonna make the action like this. We're gonna call the type change. Yes, cool. I already have a type somewhere. We're gonna call it change name. And we're going to pass it. So we at Smashing Boxes, we use payload. I don't know if that's good. It's good terminology, but it makes sense to me. So we're going to make it like that, and we're going to pass in name. There we go. And we're going to pass the action to the dispatch. Now we're going to send this through and see if anything works. It shouldn't because I haven't finished it out yet. There we go. And it works. What happened? Oh, we still have the same state going in. Forgot about that. Well, what's going to happen here is we're going to, gosh, I can never remember what case, there it is, case statements look like. There we go. And we're going to return an immutable object. And I'm about to talk about that in 1 second. But I just want to make sure everything works. Cool. Everything's still good. So I wouldn't be doing my Redux diligence if I didn't talk about immutability. It's the idea that you want to never set your old state. You always want to pass a new state in instead of modifying the old state. And to give you an idea, maybe I have changed the name 3 times. I've changed it from Dojo Bali to Jordan to Dojo. Well, we never want this here, or this actual object, to be modified. We want instead to have this always exist, but then have a new object come through. And that, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. I can talk later about why it's good or bad. But even with this, and I'm going to restart the server just to make sure everything's still coming in. Okay. Just want to make sure that we want to figure out this example, everything's still working. Cool. So with this, you can see that I'm using this syntax. This syntax, I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's just typical. It's typical syntax now. It's ES6, and it's using something called the spread operator. All you need to know is that by passing in this and then running this, I'm creating a whole new object. I'm not modifying this. However, if I get rid of this and instead do this, it still works. And so it's this example, it's not going to affect what you see in this UI, but it's going to affect other things down the road. There's going to be things that maybe don't work out so well because you were changing the initial object, which is what happened here. I just changed the initial state object. But this is trying to explain, I don't know, the mutability is tough to explain. So I know in presentations you should give visuals. So I made something to explain all the things that are easy to explain in 5 minutes. Immutability is not one of them. So I brought in an expert who I think may be able to explain it a little bit better. They return a new state of the application by returning a completely new object. It can be the clone of the current state, but can never be a modified state. And that was from Daria's thesis, so it was really official. So thank you, Daria. Yeah, this is the hard part about this, or about immutability, is that it's to understand why it's working or why it's useful. It's not apparent right off the bat. But if you guys give me like 10 more minutes, I'll explain why it might be helpful. So let's talk about let's finish this out with the rest of the dispatches. So I still have this.setState being called in 2 places, here and here. And I want to use the reducer to actually finish this off, because the purpose of Redux is to stop using well, there's a lot of purposes, but I want to use it to stop using setState in this way. So, oops, there we go. I'm going to go ahead and make a new action. And this is hard. Man, typing in front of everybody, that's a lot of pressure. You get just always so much going on with it. I don't know what I named this last time. Oh man, I was hoping to pop up. Let's call get all projects. There we go. And I want to pass in this object so we can then make that the payload. There we go. And, oops. We got to return the dispatch with this action. And let's make sure it happens the same thing down here. We'll bring this down to update feature project so we can stop using setState here. Yes. I love when I've already typed it somewhere. And all we need to do is pass in the feature project. There we go. And now let's see if this all works. Nope, we broke something. And by the way, I mean me. I shouldn't hold you guys accountable like that. There we go. All right, and unexpected token, of course. Another one, because I copy and paste it. See, this is the fun of live coding. Get all these errors. All right, so we're not working right off the bat. We need to figure out what went wrong here. So we're still dispatching an action. We have change name going through. Oh, of course. I didn't even set the stuff in the reducer. See? Got to make sure you set your reducers. So we need new cases. We need to make sure that get all projects is an action type that the reducer expects. We need to make sure that update feature project is also an action type that it expects. And so let's make sure that we're doing this right. And I'm going to cheat. There we go. Projects equals the action, the payload, the projects, and feature project. There we go. Cool. Now let's make sure this all works. Awesome. Right off the bat, it's working. Not right off the bat. There's like 4 errors. It's working. We're using Redux now to still display the same data that we were just using for local state. So this is I guess cool and everything to do it this way, but we have to ask these questions. is this better? Is this cleaner? Does this solve, I don't know, or readability problems? It's tough to say right off the bat. This was a small example, and it's tough to say whether this solved our problems, but we know that we did this the Redux way. And I'm going to talk about that really quickly. If you remember what I said earlier about how opinionated it is, it said that state has to be represented by a JavaScript object. That's what we're doing here. We're having this initial object, which is storing everything. So we're meeting principle 1. All changes must be passed as JavaScript objects. The action is an object we're passing through. We're getting it to here, and we're still returning a new object. So we're still representing these changes as objects, and we're passing it via pure functions. And all pure functions means there's no side effects in your function. We're not doing something else up here like update everything. We're not doing that. And we're not changing the initial arguments. They're staying the same. We're creating a whole new state. And so we're meeting all of the principles. It's working. But again, is that good? Is it working? Is it doing is it giving us an advantage at the moment? Well, with this example, it can be kind of confusing because I have the dispatch method in the component. That is atypical. That's not how it works in Redux. The dispatch method belongs in something called a store. And just to give you a quick idea what a store might look like, here's a function called createStore. And then you would do something like this.store is equal to createStore, passing in the reducer, yada, 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 whatever. And then the store, all you're going to be doing is 4 things. The store only does 4 things for Redux. It stores the state, it gives you the state, it dispatches your actions, and it'll call a listener for the UI, like maybe a render function. It's nothing this is not exactly what the state looks like in Redux, the package, but it's not too far off either. It does just a few things. And so if I brought the store in, I could then change or stop using dispatch in the component itself. In this case, the component, again, is our store, and it's what's actually storing our state. And that's not necessarily what you would want to do, but in this small example, it's fine. So get back to the questions at hand. Don't need to say this. To get back to the questions at hand, is this cleaner? Well, if we look at this, we see all this stuff happening up here. We see a reducer up here. This would be in its own file usually. We put the reducer in its own file. We would put the dispatch method in its own file. We would move all this elsewhere. So forget about the size, but is it better that we can see in change name that we're not actually changing the state here? All we're doing is seeing this action, which is called change name, which takes the argument of name. Is that good? Is that better? Maybe. But maybe over time it could be cleaner. So in this example, it's small. So I personally wouldn't bring in Redux for this example ever, but for this, it kind of makes sense. And again, if you ever get to something something like my portfolio, like where there's a lot of UI going on, maybe it makes sense. There's we have a lot of things that are changing as I move through, and trying to convey that with just local state can be difficult. So maybe that's one example where we could use it. Or maybe if you wanted, I don't know what I just did. I hope that didn't break everything. I think I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. Maybe I wanted Shanahan to be the default project, whatever. It's not going to ever do that until I have actually used local storage or cookie storage with my store to save that or to persist that data. So again, this small example doesn't make it necessarily necessary, but there may be things down the road that would have made Redux necessary for this example. So the most important thing to say is maybe we don't have to bring in Redux to make things persist. Again, this example of Shanahan, and while keep persisting. I mean, we could bring in we could do our own thing. We could use cookie storage. We could use browser storage. But doing that fancy JavaScript solution is Redux. And so that's what we can use in this example. Or that's what we can use instead of writing our own thing. So I want to keep going to that. Let's talk about some examples. So I'm going to use 2 right here. So unfortunately, all of my good Redux examples are in private repositories for clients, and they don't really want us sharing their code. So it's It's understandable. They paid us to write it. So I'm going to show only things that I made myself. So this is just a little thing I made to show open mic nights in the area where I live in North Carolina. But you can see it's just a one-page application. You click things, it changes the map. It now shows a different marker. It's nothing too fancy. In this example, I'm just going to use local state. I have no need to bring in Redux. That wasn't necessarily a decision. That was a guy who I'm working on it with. He made that decision. So I just went along with it, but it makes sense. We don't need Redux for just this. It doesn't make sense. But for my portfolio, which has a bunch of relationships going on, and maybe my API wasn't designed well. I did make this a long time ago. And I have, again, a lot of UI changes that are happening. That may be a good example of when Redux is needed. There's a lot that if I had used local state, I think would have complicated this project and put me past that part in the graph where it crosses, that part where it costs me more time. And the last example is our web boilerplate at work. This is just what we use to start things off. I just showed this as an example to show maybe what a clean React Redux project looks like. And there we go. And let me zoom in on this. It's simply, we can take out things like actions, containers, reducers, services. We can move all these in their own files, and that helps with everything. I'm going to include this this repository in my resources afterwards, so you guys can look at it if you want. But Redux, just in this little example, you can see how it can kind of make the file structure a little cleaner. So let's get to the part where, why should I use Redux? I just spent a decent amount of time kind of vaguely hinting at why it might be useful. But I talked more about why state is good. And there's good reasons to use Redux. It gives you cleaner code. I asked all my friends whether they thought this was cleaner, and he said that Redux is cleaner. It uses the single responsibility principle a lot. You got pure functions everywhere, and that makes things so much cleaner. But most importantly, in React, your components will no longer show how state is changing. Instead, they'll show what's happening to your state. And that's nice for your component. Your component should be separated in that manner. And so it can really give you a feeling of cleaner code. Again, I talked about these folders here. And the actual, when you see it and separate like this, it can kind of make it feel a little bit cleaner if you can separate things in that manner. It can make changing your whole project or the UI of your project in the middle of it somewhat easy, way easier than if you would put all your state in your components. In fact, this is all Redux. The store, the reducers, the actions, React Redux, the containers is just what's bridging this together. And components in a React Redux application are just dumb. They don't do anything. They barely deal with state. Not that you can't use setState with it, but it's unnecessary. So if you want to change your whole UI mid-project, the meat of your application, everything that's going on with your state and everything that's going on behind the scenes is here. And so it makes it changing all of this very easy. It makes bug fixing easy. And this is the part I was talking about with immutability and why there are advantages. And this is the example here from the actual Redux DevTools. You can see the tools that come with that make debugging Redux easy. It's because for this, because you are immutable with your objects the whole time, if you use the Redux DevTools or whatever tool you want, you can see the state before, after, and during your actions, which will make debugging really easy. You can go back and see the state at any point in time. So maybe I could see whenever it was just at Dojo Bali and not Jordan as the name. And that'll be super helpful down the road for debugging. There you go. And persisting state is pretty easy. Maybe this looks like a fancy, function, but it's not. All you need to see is that you can pass in storage. So we usually use cookie storage. It doesn't matter. You can use whatever you want. But if you use storage like this, you can persist things throughout as long as you want. If I wanted Shanahan, and Walke to be the feature project no matter what, or sorry, if I clicked on that during the actual UI process, it can remain the feature project because I'm storing it. And that's a huge, huge benefit of Redux. Not that you can't use cookie storage on your own or whatever you want. It's just, it's really easy to do with Redux. So, the conclusion. Use Redux if you need changes to persist after a refresh. Use Redux if you have a very active UI with a lot of clicking, and use Redux if you're passing down state to X or more files. I don't know what that number is, but basically if that front end gets huge, that's probably a time to either bring in Redux or have, if you expect that to happen, it's a time to have used it beforehand. We use Redux on all of our client projects. Not because, I don't know, we want to make things complicated, but because we want to be prepared for if any of these three things happen. If we don't have Redux and one of these three things happen, we're going to kind of be screwed. We want to make sure that we're always prepared for it. We feel like it's a great long-term solution because if any of these things happen, Redux will make it much, much easier. However, that's what we use at Smashing Boxes. And I showed you just my portfolio. And I made like one more visual because all the times, there's been all these times I've decided on setState and Redux. And I don't think I've ever just gone with setState. I think I've always just used Redux. And so I hope this visual explains how bad I am at just going with setState. One more thing. What was it? There we go. The Dan quote. He says that if you're just learning React, don't make Redux your first choice. I hope, while I've shown how you can use Redux in an application with my example, you can see that to change the state, you have to do a lot of things. And you have to understand a lot of things that are going on. And if you're just learning React, you don't need Redux for that. You have to kind of decide, even once you know Redux, if taking all that time to change your state is worth it. Come back to Redux if you find a real need for it, or if you want to try something new. To close this out, I want to give a thank you to Greg, who's not here because he lives in the United States, and he's kind of like, he's my senior developer at my company who has somewhat mentored me on Redux. And so if he ever sees this, which I don't think he will because he has better things to do with his life, thank you, Greg. You're a super good mentor. Luke, who's also not here because he got a stomach virus, but we were roommates, and he just talked to me about Redux and helped me get some good talking points down. And then Daria for letting me use her thesis and quote her, which she didn't know about that second part. Yeah. All right. That's it. Thank you, guys.